I rise to make a presentation on the National Assembly Elections Amendment Bill 2020. The truth is, Mr. Speaker, that initially I wasn't minded to make a presentation. But as I sat and as I listened, I think it is necessary, Mr. Speaker, for me to make some statements relative to this debate. I make them, Mr. Speaker, one, out of some particular experiences that I've had, but more so, Mr. Speaker, as a citizen of the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis, and one who I think has some understanding relative to the right to vote. Mr. Speaker, I've been involved in elective politics since the year 2004. I seem to recall, Mr. Speaker, that at the end of every single election here in the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis, we have had many controversial matters. Perhaps I should add that not only at the end of each election, but even throughout the process leading up to general elections here in the Federation. You have had many cases before the court, Mr. Speaker, relative to persons registering and voting in constituencies where they ought not to have registered. The Honorable Attorney General in his presentation would have made reference to one such matter which ended up before the court relative to Laureen James versus Dudley Williams. In my own constituency, Mr. Speaker, I've had to object to persons who should not have been able to register in St. Christopher 5, and also had a case which ended up before the court, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, outside of that, you have also had matters being taken before the court relative to constituency boundaries. As recently as the elections of 2020 and prior to the elections of 2015 and the elections of 2010. In all of those matters, I have been a party to those cases, Mr. Speaker. Even as we are here in this National Assembly, we still have the matter of 2015 before the court. That is a matter which would have gone, Mr. Speaker, to as far as the Privy Council. And maybe while I am on that particular point, Mr. Speaker, that it should be pointed out that one of the key things which came out of that particular court matter was that to do with the gazetting of those boundaries which an attempt had been made to change 1 month before a general election. And so there are 2 points there, Mr. Speaker, that I can speak to. In the first instance, we're hearing about a rush to make changes to the electoral laws. As far as I'm aware, Mr. Speaker, the last election was held on the 5th of June, 2020. Constitutionally, the next election, Mr. Speaker, is due sometime in 2025. We are in the month of October, July, August, September, October. Only 4 months after the last general election, and approximately some 4 years and 8 months before a next general election is due to be held in the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis. So, Mr. Speaker, when persons refer to a rush, there is no rush because there is no election which is due at this particular point in time. Unlike 2015, whereby 1 month before the general elections had been held, there was a rush then, Mr. Speaker, to change the boundaries here in the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis. Mr. Speaker, you can determine the difference for yourself when one speaks to a rush. Mr. Speaker, I mentioned gazetting. And one of the reasons, Mr. Speaker, why we would have been successful in 2015 is that the Privy Council agreed that that particular matter could not have been gazetted within the time stated. Because until it is gazetted, Mr. Speaker, it doesn't become law. The point I am making, Mr. Speaker, is that I'm hearing that there are some persons who today may have been here for a year as Commonwealth citizens, and thus they are able to be registered to vote. Mr. Speaker, it therefore means that until this particular piece of legislation is gazetted, that those individuals, they still can go, Mr. Speaker, and register to vote. As a matter of fact, Mr. Speaker, this particular piece of legislation came before the Parliament in September for a first reading. So that all of those opposite, Mr. Speaker, who are expressing a concern about be it constituents or other persons not being able to register, they should have read it then, Mr. Speaker, and informed those persons that the law is about to change, and as such, take advantage now of the opportunity to become registered voters. That is the simple point, Mr. Speaker. But instead, we're in this Parliament hearing something absolutely different from those who say they care about their constituents and constituents not being able to register to vote. Mr. Speaker, I can even take that point a little further. Because, Mr. Speaker, when a law comes into effect, sometimes we benefit on one hand or we lose on the other hand, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, prior to, I think it would have been last year, it was illegal to smoke marijuana, to grow marijuana here in the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis. There are persons, Mr. Speaker, who would have suffered time in prison. There are persons, Mr. Speaker, who would have suffered from having a criminal record that prevented them from gaining certain things. There are persons, Mr. Speaker, who would have been fined because that was the law then. But when the law changes, Mr. Speaker, the law changes, and it means that going forward, this is what pertains. And therefore, that is the point, Mr. Speaker, that if you are able to register after living here for 1 year, that no longer pertains if you are outside of the Commonwealth, the CARICOM area, Mr. Speaker. It's as simple as that. Mr. Speaker, once ago, you park any place on the road. Today, the police paints a yellow line. And what is your argument? That for the last 5 years I was able to park here and I should be able to continue to park here because I did it for the last 5 years? The law has changed. And so if the law has changed, Mr. Speaker, you abide and you adjust within the confines of the law. It is simple. Mr. Speaker, I was in here as a member of the opposition then, and a bill was brought to this Parliament in terms of the age at which persons can sell alcohol, the age at which persons can consume alcohol. And so what does someone who was then 17 years and 9 months and had been accustomed to do it say? I've been accustomed to do it, and so the law has changed and I should be able to continue to do so. The law doesn't work like that, Mr. Speaker. The law has changed, and so going forward, this is the new law, and this is what you are expected to abide by, Mr. Speaker. As simple as that. And it seems as though some persons on the opposite side simply cannot comprehend that simple fact, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, There was a time I lived outside of St. Kitts. There was a time, Mr. Speaker, I lived in St. Thomas. Shortly after graduating from high school, Mr. Speaker, I migrated there. And Mr. Speaker, I lived there for several years. Caribbean country, non-Commonwealth, yes, non-CARICOM. But I lived there, Mr. Speaker. I studied there. I worked there. I paid taxes there, Mr. Speaker. But never once, Mr. Speaker, during that particular point in time, had the right to become a registered voter in that territory, because there is a criteria in place. And if you don't meet that particular criteria, Mr. Speaker, you can't register. I'm hearing persons saying that because you come here, you're paying taxes, you own a house, etc., that you should be able to participate and vote after 1 year. Mr. Speaker, it doesn't work like that in other places. And so you could live in the US, you could live in St. Thomas right here in the Caribbean for 5, 10, 15, 20 years as a permanent resident. But until you become a citizen, Mr. Speaker, you can't vote, you cannot participate in the voting process. I've heard students come in here and they get a Commonwealth scholarship, or we have students who are going overseas because they received a Commonwealth scholarship, and as such, you have those sort of relationships and they should be able to vote. Mr. Speaker, we send students overseas to St. Thomas, for example, but they can't vote. We have a partnership with the University of the Virgin Islands. We offer scholarships to students to go to school there, but they are aware of the fact that when they go there, they do not qualify to become a registered voter there. And so why should someone, Mr. Speaker, who has come to St. Kitts or Nevis for the sake of attending university, simply after 1 year be able to qualify as a registered voter here? Why? You come here for the sake of getting an education, not to establish residency. For the sake of merely getting an education. And in my case, I didn't go to St. Thomas merely to get an education. I went there to live and couldn't vote.
Not easy to vote in anybody else country.
But you come here to go to school to get an education.
Yes,
Should you simply be able, after 1 year of attending classes here, go over to the electoral office and say, I want to vote here, and then you vote, let's say, in the election of 2020, and 2 years after, you finish school, you're gone. Can't get off the name. But you would have made, Mr. Speaker, you would have made a difference in some constituency. And you vote for someone who the persons are ordinarily resident in that constituency may not want. But they have to live with the choice that you made when you're going back to your country, Mr. Speaker. And we are saying is that a criteria must be in place, and if you are outside of the CARICOM Commonwealth area, you must live, you must ordinarily be resident here for 3 years before you have that right. That is simple, Mr. Speaker. Not you establish a medical university, let's say in West Bastille, and so you build a dorm to accommodate 200-300 persons, and it's 200-300 persons, whether they come from India, Nigeria, some other Commonwealth country, and 300 of those persons end up on the list simply after a year. And it means that in that first year, you will have 200-300. By the time you get in more students, more of them become eligible to register, and then they graduate, they leave, the names there on the list, and you're having difficulties to remove them, Mr. Speaker. But apart from the difficulties to remove them, Mr. Speaker, Should they be able to thwart the will of the people in constituency number 3?
So a Dominican can and a St. Lucia can?
Is it right, Mr. Speaker? It is not right. And that is what we are speaking to, Mr. Speaker. Correcting, Mr. Speaker, some of those anomalies. We cannot allow them, Mr. Speaker, to continue forever. We are here to correct those things. The very same citizens of St. Kitts and Nevis that they have referred to, they have been speaking about these very same things year after year after year. Persons from across the political divide have been saying that we need to bring an end to these, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, you listen to some of the members opposite, you would swear that it's only in St. Kitts and Nevis, Mr. Speaker, is that you have a residency requirement. In our case, we are saying 3 years. We heard mention of Antigua, Mr. Speaker. Antigua was mentioned over and over again. But what is the case in Antigua? In Antigua, the law says that you must be resident 6 months in a constituency in order to be able to register in that constituency. It also says, as a Commonwealth citizen, you must be resident 7 years. 7 long years.
No distinction.
7 long years before you are able to register to vote in Antigua. You look at Barbados. Barbados says 3 months in a constituency and 3 years in the country.
No distinction.
You go down, Mr. Speaker, St. Lucia. 2 months in a constituency if you're a citizen. But Commonwealth, 7 years
No distinction
in
again.
country.
No distinction.
7 years.
Substantive point.
7 years. 7 long years. And even if you want to accept what the senator opposite is saying, we are saying at least if you're from CARICOM, that we have certain treaties with, certain agreements with, certain free movement, for example, within OECS, in terms of CARICOM, movement of people with skill certificate, etc., Mr. Speaker, we are saying 1 year.
Why the
1
distinction now
year.
and not the distinction for the citizenship?
1 year,
Why
Mr.
are we
Speaker.
treating them differently?
We are saying 1 year.
Why is it
That is what we are saying.
it's different for voting but
Because
not citizenship?
we recognize that in terms of this particular region, CARICOM, OECS, we are basically moving into one in terms of integrating as a common community, one single community. See, that is the point, Mr. Speaker, is that we are making. That is the point, Mr. Speaker, that we are making. I have heard questions being asked, Mr. Speaker. What if you go overseas to attend university? What if you go overseas for medical treatment? What if you go overseas as an ambassador? And those will be covered, Mr. Speaker, in the statutory rules and orders, because it is not everything that you spell out in legislation, Mr. Speaker. Legislation speaks to the substantive part of the law, the principal part of the law. And then, Mr. Speaker, you have the statutory rules and orders which would address those other aspects of the legislation. For example, Mr. Speaker, if you pick up the National Assembly Election Amendment Bill with all of the amendments which have been made over the years, you don't see in there that in terms of being able to object to an individual, this is the process, because those are covered, Mr. Speaker, in the SRNOs. And so those will be covered in the SRNOs. You go overseas as a student, you haven't moved from one constituency to the next. You go overseas to get medical treatment, You have not moved from one constituency to the next. The member for number one,
You have ceased to reside.
the member for number one, Mr. Speaker, said, what if you go overseas for medical treatment? And I said to him, well then, register in the hospital overseas. Because you have not moved from one constituency to the next. The Act speaks about moving from one constituency to the next.
Cease to reside.
And that is what she
A
said.
agent could say that.
Oh, yeah.
To speak on the point of order, I rise on the point of order because I think the member who's having this room now is misleading his house. He's talking about someone moving overseas. The law says cease to
I
reside.
didn't say move overseas. I said students, medical treatment,
Please cease to
etc.
reside here. That is why in the original. That is why in the original law before 1984 Constitution, every year, if you were not there, when enumeration was done, you were removed. I was a student, I was removed.
Read the first part of the
You
section.
understand?
Read
So
the
that is
first
what
part of the
you
section.
understand. Cease to reside.
Read the first part of the section.
Mr. Speaker, I rise on a point of order because there seems to be a misreading of the bill. It says there, in the amendment 37 subsection 3, where a person who is ordinary resident in St. Christopher and Nevis. This is not anybody has moved overseas. This phrase is very much there. Where a person who is ordinary resident in St. Christopher and Nevis. There's nothing about moving overseas in that. It's only dealing with those who are here.
Registered as a voter for constituency.
Is to reside in that constituency. So you're a resident here, and you have to reside in this constituency.
What the law says, you don't say it.
But that's what it says here. I'm reading it.
Does not say that.
Let me read it again for you. Where a person who is ordinary resident in St. Christopher and Nevis is registered as a voter for...
You just read it.
But I'm saying it is
I
here.
don't believe that what you are reading, that is the intention.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
No, it says cease to reside. How do you explain that?
You move from this constitution to another one.
Why don't you say it?
Mr. Speaker, I continue.
He doesn't say that.
And so, Mr. Speaker, I think the Honorable Attorney General, in his point of order, has made the point.
He doesn't say that.
You're ordinarily resident in St. Christopher and Nevis, and you're moving from one constituency to the next in St. Christopher and Nevis. Again, very simple, Mr. Speaker. Very, very simple. So you do not become disqualified because you've gone overseas for medical treatment. And when I responded to the member for number one, he said, well, he hopes that I'm the matron for the hospital. Well, I don't know what he means by that because, you could have a female matron, you could have a male matron. So I really don't. That was a non-point like most of the other things that he said. Simple as that. Non-point.
He didn't say it that way. Don't try that.
No, but it was a non-point.
It was a
That
point.
was out of context. You got no basis or relevance.
And so, Mr. Speaker, you send someone overseas to serve as an ambassador, if that person still retains the right to vote in the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis. You go overseas as a student, whether to UE, UVI, Cuba, Taiwan, wherever you go. You still remain as a voter in that particular constituency because you have gone overseas simply for that purpose. You haven't moved out of the constituency. You have gone to pursue studies to return to the Federation and hopefully to where you were ordinarily resident.
Because Valerie is somebody who is living overseas and don't reside here. That moved overseas. That not moved to another constituency. So remain registered in the constituency was I said. You bought that carry for authority in 2007, 2008.
Mr. Speaker,
The constituency where you
again,
remain there.
I heard,
You understand what
well,
I'm saying?
if you move from one constituency to the
What
next,
is your movement reform?
because you have a girlfriend here,
You did that.
And so you want to register there. Then, Mr. Speaker, it makes a mockery of the system.
Yes.
It makes a mockery of the system, Mr. Speaker, and there are 2 points I want to make on that, Mr. Speaker. In the first instance, Mr. Speaker, you heard from, I think, is the Honorable Attorney General. I'm a member of the Boundaries Commission. And in looking at the boundaries, one of the qualifications that one would take into consideration based on the Constitution is that it says there must be equality in terms of the number of persons residing in each constituency, persons who live here. And so, Mr. Speaker, if you think of the intent of that particular criterion, Mr. Speaker, it speaks to representing as close as possible an equal number of persons within a particular constituency. It makes a mockery, Mr. Speaker, of the system that we have here, where you have constituencies. For somebody to go here today, decide, well, I sleep in here for a week to 3 weeks, and so I can register to vote in this particular constituency. It makes a total mockery of having constituency boundaries.
Yes.
Total mockery, Mr. Speaker.
Right.
And so, Mr. Speaker, you go, you have a child. You have a child. Okay, you have a child in Tabernacle. You have a child in Tabernacle. You go to Tabernacle because the child is living there. Does it mean that you have moved to Tabernacle, Mr. Speaker? It doesn't necessarily mean that you have moved to Tabernacle. And the second point, Mr. Speaker, even if someone is of the view that you have moved to Tabernacle and make an objection, Mr. Speaker, simply making an objection does not mean that your name is going to be removed from St. Paul's, because there is a process. There is a process. And many of us in here, we have been involved in that particular process.
How come the process?
We go back to the point, Mr. Speaker, James versus Williams, and in that particular matter, the first part of the process isn't moving the court to hear the case. There's an objection process. The list comes out. You're able to make objections if you're already on the list. A big list comes out at the end of January. You're able to go through the list. You make the determination, is this person qualified to vote in this particular constituency? And anyone within the constituency can do it. So even as you listen, you get the impression that is members of parliament maybe trying to disenfranchise person. Anyone in the constituency, Mr. Speaker, can make an objection to a name appearing on the list. Anyone who is registered in that constituency. Let me make that point. And so, you go and you have a particular time in which to put in the objection. How many days after the list comes out? 10 days. So the list comes out the 31st of January. You have until the 10th of February to make an objection. There's a form that you complete. You put in your name, you put in your address, where in the constituency you're eligible to vote. You put in the name of the voter, I think you put in the profession of the voter, and you state the reason as to why you are objecting to that person. And it's not just persons, Mr. Speaker, who may not be resident in the constituency. Someone has died, and the name is still on the list. That process also covers those individuals. And after you would have submitted that to the electoral office, sometime thereafter, notice is posted in the constituency of the persons who are objected to. Apart from that notice, mails are sent out to registered mails, are sent out to the individuals at the address that they claim they live within the constituency. I understand they are now solved. So you're solved with that notice, Mr. Speaker. And you show up to an objection hearing. If you want to bring a lawyer with you to the hearing, you can bring a lawyer with you to the hearing. You can bring witnesses to prove that this is where you live. So you bring all that you can bring. to prove where you live. And so you go through that process, and at the end of the day, the registration officer makes a determination as to whether or not you should be registered in that constituency. He may say no, he may say yes. And if you disagree with the decision, Mr. Speaker, you then move to the court for the court to make a determination and to give a declaration. So there is a process which goes further than the electoral office, a process which gives you the right to access the court if you feel that someone is trying to disenfranchise you from a particular constituency or being able to vote. Many cases have gone to court. The Honorable Member for number 8, he has had cases before the court. Plenty. Number 4. You have had cases before the court. So that when I heard the point, oh, you're going to the electoral office, and if the person in there want to come out and see you, they're back there hiding. The only person they used to hide is a man named Parrott, who went into hiding after the elections of 2015. People in there hiding, they don't want to come out and see you. You have redress. There's a process, and the law outlines the process. You have the member here for Nevis, 9, who had a matter that went before the court too, to do with registration of voters and where they ought to be registered, and whether or not they had the right to be moved from one constituency to the next, etc. He can better speak to it than I can. But his matter also ended up before the court, for the court to give redress. At the end of it, I think you had to have a by-election in that particular constituency. The court is there, and the cases are there, the examples are there, Mr. Speaker, as to how the system ought to work. What we're here to do is to tidy up the system. And it is the voters out there, the residents of St. Kitts and Nevis, the citizens, who have said to us that these things ought to change.
Gave us the mandate.
Gave us a mandate, an overwhelming mandate. Yes. And that is why I've also said to those opposite, be careful. Do not be misled. Because the last person who misled those on the opposite side, they're no longer here.
Yes, true.
No longer here. And they would want to use that as fear warning. Mr. Speaker, it's as simple as that. We have criteria in place, even to become a member of this National Assembly. There's a criteria in place. Mr. Speaker, he said earlier he came in here in 2004. By the election of 2010, I came in here, all pieces of legislation were being passed in here to say that when you got to be nominated, you have to sign this, and if it is you tell some lie, the registration, not the registration officer, but the returning officer can make a determination as to whether or not my name can go on the ballot. It was challenged before the court. So even though you come in here, you pass law, and persons think that the law is unconstitutional, you can go court. So if there are those who feel that what we are doing here today is unconstitutional, they can challenge it before the court. And so that matter went court. And the court decided the particular piece of legislation was null and void. The point is, Mr. Speaker, that they said I was in violation of the Constitution in terms of being a member of Parliament because I held dual citizenship. The United States of America and St. Kitts and Nevis. The Constitution says you can only have one citizenship to be here. And so I went and I renounced the US citizenship because that is what the Constitution says in order to be able to become an elected member of Parliament. Fair enough. Mr. Speaker, the interesting thing is, the hypocritical thing about it, Mr. Speaker, the very same persons who brought the particular piece of legislation to Parliament was put out of the parliament, Mr. Speaker, by the very court. Evicted. Like a common what? Like a common criminal, you say? That's evicted like a common criminal, Mr. Speaker. Evicted from the parliament, Mr. Speaker. Because the very same person, Mr. Speaker, got citizenship for the country of Dominica, the Commonwealth of Dominica. A passport. I take it back. I withdraw. I withdraw. The very same person. He sit down here when I asked him, you have a passport? He said, no. And I asked him again, he said, no. And when he said, Mr. Speaker, I'm being harassed.
I don't think so.
But ultimately, Mr. Speaker, the court determined that by virtue of having the passport, you're not eligible to be a member of parliament. And so there's eligibility, Mr. Speaker. How do you become eligible to vote?
I didn't hear that.
You know, I heard the next argument, Mr. Speaker. I heard the next argument that because I'm from India or wherever I am from, I am just as responsible as other persons. Well, then should we make the argument, Mr. Speaker, is that at 17, I'm just as mature as the person who is 18, and so I should be able to register to vote, Mr. Speaker?
My neighbor's been very here.
Pardon?
My neighbor's been very here.
Exactly. So should I make the argument I'm just as responsible? I could be 16, 17. When I finished with high school, I was 16. You could be 17 out there working, paying social security, establish a business, etc. But it doesn't mean that you can vote. You become eligible to vote at the age of 18. Qualifications. What is wrong, Mr. Speaker, with having qualifications? That is what we are saying. This is how you qualify to vote. If you're a citizen, immediately upon turning 18, you're able to register.
Yes.
You're from within the CARICOM area. You have been living here not for 1 month, not for 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months, but for 1 year, you are able to register.
And then not being discriminated relative to those who are born here.
No, no discrimination.
Except if you're from Ghana.
If you're from outside, if you're from outside the CARICOM area,
There is a distinction.
then you must be here for 3 years in order to qualify to become a voter. Those already on the list, they remain on the list. But if you aren't on the list as yet and you don't go before the law is gazetted, then you have to wait until you're here for 3 years. And as I said, Mr. Speaker, we are 4 years and 8 months out from an election. So, maybe you know something I don't know. And I could understand you want to get rid of the leader of the opposition, so you would want the election sooner. I could understand that. I can understand that. Pardon? Who's please? That's what I said, yes. Okay. So, Mr. Speaker, 4 years, 8 months. So even if when the borders open, at the end of October you come in, you continue to live here, you have 3 years from now, this 2020, October 2023, you become eligible. Because in the election before then, we're building a stronger, safer future. The people of the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis gave us a stronger mandate to build a stronger, safer future, and that is what we are concentrating on. I recall when we came here with the piece of legislation to deal with the state of emergency. Man, you had one set of noise coming from the opposite benches. We put in state of emergency in place because we want to call an election and we want to do this and we want to do that. And we ain't calling the election until June of 2020. And when we call the election, the very same people say, they went to the court, they said, me not ready yet. They were up and down ringing bell. He said, if we ain't ring the bell, they're going to ring it. And when we ring they had 1 week. Huh? They had a cattle bell. The member for number 2 say, you don't know what kind of bell it is. You know, sometimes when you play masquerade, I don't know if the masquerade got them little bells on them still. I be what kind of bell they had. Not a soul hear the bell. And so the election, I'm not mocking the culture. I'm saying those little bells, it is like one of those little bells that they had. What about that is mocking the culture?
Nothing.
Yeah, don't mock the culture.
Nothing.
Man, you sound like say after me.
Don't mock the culture, he's right.
Sound like one of those little bells.
Yes.
Yeah, you know the bells that they used to go and the masquerade thing them. Could I hardly hear it? Come like it's one of those bells they had. And so by the time the election come, they made history.
Yes.
See that they never lose before.
Yes.
They lost.
Yes.
Never lose the West Must be that's what you say when you're on stage. And see that they never lost before for the very first time in the history of adult suffrage. They lost the seats. When you say weak leadership? Weak leadership, some say. And so, Mr. Speaker, I think I have said enough on this particular piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker. The National Assembly Elections Amendment Bill 2020. Mr. Speaker, I am fully supportive of this piece of legislation. And as such, Mr. Speaker, I wish it safe passage, and certainly I will be voting in favor of the legislation being passed in this National Assembly. May it so please you, Mr. Speaker.